serving in the army. This is an ABC News special report.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Peter Jennings at ABC News headquarters in New York. We interrupt our regular program because on this Sunday, October the 7th, the U.S. has begun a mission to Afghanistan. It is primarily humanitarian at this point, but we can tell you, based on several dispatches from Kabul, the Afghan capital, in the last while. I'll just quote them. The Reuters news agency says the Afghan capital is under attack and there have been multiple rocket strikes. Reuters also says there have been thunderous explosions throughout the city and anti-aircraft fire heard in the city. And the Associated Press says that 3 big flashes were heard on the front line north of Kabul. Now, we've known for several hours that the U.S. was planning to begin dropping food on Afghanistan. Aircraft took off from Europe, which is about 7 or 8 hours away, and may have positioned themselves and may already be on that mission. But we're uncertain about the precise nature of that at this moment. We're going to give you what information we can and try to sketch out precisely what is happening and why. And we're going to start at the Pentagon with ABC's John McCarthy. John.
Peter, it seems likely that an attack that the United States has been planning and that we have been anticipating for nearly a month now is finally underway. Pentagon sources have been saying that the first set of targets that are likely to be struck are going to be air defense systems. And then following that, the United States would most likely be dropping food in various parts of Afghanistan where the Taliban government is not likely to get their hands on it and where the United States could get the food rations and blankets and other things that are needed to various Afghan people who are in need of it.
John, Reuters is now saying that a large plume of smoke has been seen over the Afghan capital, and behind you in that building, spokesmen are saying we can't confirm or deny any operational details. However, on the basis of what you knew this morning, is this meant to be a parallel mission, partly humanitarian, partly military?
Peter, it seems very clear that the United States does want to make a symbolic gesture of putting in quite a bit of food from high altitudes to people who need them. But you do not put unarmed transport aircraft over hostile territory without taking down some of the air defense capability, or all of it, if the United States is able to do that. So it seems quite likely, at a minimum, that the United States is attacking anything that could put into jeopardy the transport planes that are dropping that food, and the airstrikes could be much broader than that. We simply don't know at this point.
Okay, John, thanks very much. We're actually going to hear from Ari Fleischer, who is the White House spokesman, in about a minute and a half from now, which leads me to ask Tony Cordesman, our principal military analyst, to give me 30 seconds, Tony, on what the Afghans could be defending themselves with at the moment.
They have a few obsolete high-altitude surface-to-air missiles, less than 20 obsolete MiG-21 fighters, but they have a lot of anti-aircraft guns and a lot of manned portable surface-to-air missiles.
And does the United States know precisely where most of that equipment is?
No, Peter. In most cases, we're going to have to learn the hard way, but it has very, very limited capability.
And if there are multiple rocket strikes on Kabul at the moment, what would someone be likely to be trying to hit?
Well, if they really are, probably radars, possibly the air base, facilities outside Kabul, but if they're hitting in Kabul, it would be headquarters not related to air defenses.
Okay, thanks very much, Tony. I must tell you that this morning it was pretty clear from a lot of people that something was about to happen. The Northern Alliance, those anti-Taliban forces which are in northern Afghanistan for the most part, had been told that they'd like to have their airspace closed, and we'll try to get established when we hear from the White House just how U.S. planes came in, whether they came in from Turkey and across the north or came up from the south. The Taliban had made another appeal couched in rather unusual language to President Bush and said that they would be prepared to put Osama bin Laden on trial now in an Islamic court if they could get the evidence. The president said, as he has said so many times before, that full warning had been given and time was running out, and then just subsequently asked what was the part of the message they had not had earlier. This is Al Jazeera Television, the Arabic television network, and these are, we are told, live pictures from Kabul. As it was at the beginning of the attacks on Iraq in the Gulf War a decade ago, we cannot give you any specifics of what is happening because we simply do not know. but simply to repeat those very sketchy reports we're getting from Kabul itself. A lot of anti-aircraft fire, thunderous explosions, according to the Associated Press and Reuters, who have people on the ground, and Al Jazeera. Some large flashes north of the city. I have no idea what this is. Tony Cordesman, can you help?
Yes, Peter, all we're seeing is anti-aircraft guns and surface-to-air missiles. There's no coverage so far of anything hitting Kabul or in the Kabul area on that Al Jazeera picture.
Okay, thanks, Tony. I'm not even sure we're seeing surface-to-air missiles, to be perfectly honest. We're seeing a bright white light in the sky, which could be, at this point, anything. And a right to the White House and the President's spokesman.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning another front in our war against terrorism, so freedom can prevail over fear. The President will address the nation at 12:50. Thank you.
All right, when did the President give the order?
Harry Fleischer, the President's spokesman, saying that the President will address the nation in about 7 or 8 minutes from now. I want to go to David Wright, ABC's David Wright, who is in northern Afghanistan. He has been with the Northern Alliance in the last several days. And David, did you see any evidence there at all that people were headed in the direction of Kabul from the north?
Not in the direction of Kabul, Peter. All indications are that the Northern Alliance is concentrating its efforts on the city of Mazar-e-Sharif, which is a city to the north. What they have apparently been doing in the last several hours is cutting off the supply lines to the south to Kabul and to the west, Herat, and looking to concentrate their efforts there. We've been told that they are looking to stay away from Kabul, at least in the short term, until the U.S. forces and the Allied forces can secure it better.
There is a slight delay between us here in New York and David Wright. That's what occasions the silence. David, has the Northern Alliance been in action in the last several hours that you're aware of?
We have seen a good many troop movements through here in the last couple of days, and we're told by the foreign ministry officials here who work for the Northern Alliance, or the United Front as they prefer to be called, that they are indeed in action, that they have captured some 11 villages and that in the Ghor province, and that they are moving now towards the city of Aibek, which is that main supply route between Mazar-Sharif and Kabul.
Okay, David, thanks. I wonder if I can talk to Bill Rediker, who is in Uzbekistan now. Bill, just to ask you, have you heard anything, seen anything at all? You're fairly close to the border.
We haven't seen anything as of, we're only 20 or 30 miles, Peter. We haven't seen or heard anything yet. There were all sorts of signs earlier today that something might be coming up. There was a tightened security cordon around a nearby air base here. There were 2 C-17s spotted, American cargo planes coming in, so there was every indication that something was about to happen. But so far tonight, we haven't seen or heard anything.
Okay, many thanks, Bill Rediker. ABC's John Cochran is in Europe. We're not in a position to identify precisely where he is, but he's aware that this mission began earlier today, at least the humanitarian component of it. John, tell us what left Europe, and roughly, if you know, how long ago?
Well, we think it was on the order of about 6 or 7 hours ago. Just guessing how long it takes to get to Afghanistan from here. We are told that there will be pictures, that the military has put pictures, cameras on these planes. We will see these drops later on, Peter. Okay,
John Cochran in Europe, I think what's actually happened from Europe at least is that the humanitarian component of this mission, which is a lot of food on board a lot of American C-17s, these huge 4-engine transports, has flown out to the region and has at some point, we're not precisely sure where, has joined up with fighter aircraft and perhaps fighter bombers who have provided security to this particular mission and may also have joined up with a purely aggressive military component of this. We're not sure yet about that. But we are joined by General Richard Hawley, the former commander of Air Combat Command in the U.S. Air Force. General Hawley, give us at least a mental picture of a lot of humanitarian aircraft, a lot of C-17s arriving from Europe. What happens in the air before they go on the last stage of their mission?
Well, they'll be coming in with adequate fighter escort to make sure we have air superiority for those airplanes. That's the most important thing we can do
is guarantee security for those forces as they go in. The real work went on before they ever took off. The people who had to put together these food supplies and so on, rig them, get them so that they could drop at fairly high altitude, because they're not going to go down low in this kind of a threat environment. Then if any of the radar-directed defenses in Afghanistan activate, it'll be the job of the fighters to suppress those and make sure that the airlift airplanes can do their job without being seriously threatened.
Many thanks. Back to the Pentagon and John McWethy. John?
Peter, it appears that the first wave of attacks is going to be a combination of Tomahawk cruise missiles, which would be launched from ships off the coast. In addition to that, the United States has a great deal of bombing capability from the manned bombers that are in the region and bombers that can be called in from overseas. It is difficult to tell which part of this whole orchestration is underway right now, but traditionally the United States likes to hit with unmanned explosive devices first, to be followed up with greater precision from some of the manned bombers.
John, continue for just a second as we look at a map, if we can, please. That's a picture of the Tomahawk missile, but look at the map, because if these transport aircraft let from Europe, they had to be joined by a considerable force of protection or attack and protection somewhere, either coming from Turkey or coming from the Arabian Sea or even from the Persian Gulf, right?
Peter, in all likelihood, there are escort aircraft for the C-17s that probably did come from a place like Turkey, and there are also escort aircraft coming off of the aircraft carriers that would be accompanying any bombers that would be coming from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean and from some bases in the Persian Gulf.
Now,
so there are probably fighter escorts coming from both directions.
Okay, now if we just keep looking at that map for a second, you're seeing the Arabian Sea, you don't see the Indian Ocean. Way down the bottom of your screen in the Indian Ocean is Diego Garcia. That's where, among other things, B-52s fly from. There are 3 aircraft carriers, I think, John, at the moment in the Arabian Sea and 1 in the Persian Gulf, all of which could launch fighter aircraft because they're all within range, particularly given refueling, of Afghanistan itself, right?
Yeah, they're actually, the fighter aircraft that are in the Persian Gulf are at quite extended range. If, for example, the United States wanted to use those fighter aircraft that are based in Saudi Arabia, which is where most of them in the Gulf are, it's nearly 2,000 miles to the target, which requires a lot of air-to-air refueling. So most likely, they would be picking up fighter escorts from Turkey, with a series of refuelings over countries that the United States has only recently been allowed to fly over. And then, of course, the fighters that are operating off aircraft carriers, it's about 400 or 500 miles to Afghanistan from the coast of the Arabian Sea over Pakistani territory.
Tony Cordesman, our resident military analyst, a very complicated and very large military operation with both a military and a humanitarian component to it.
It is very complicated. It's particularly important that we be able to get the airdrops to the refugees, which will be dispersed over a good part of Afghanistan. At the same time, we need to be ready to take out their air defenses to make this the first step in really pressuring the Taliban to turn over al-Qaeda and bin Laden.
Tony, is there any doubt in your mind that this was planned as a military operation and as a humanitarian one, not a humanitarian one in which you may have needed a military component?
I think we need to wait and see, Peter. We'll have to see from the scale of the attack, because as yet we haven't seen any indication that the United States is striking in depth at targets in Afghanistan.
Okay, thanks, Tony. We were actually able to talk to Kabul, to at least one of the residences in Kabul a short while ago. Electricity has now gone down in the city. Telephone lines have suddenly gone dead. And so really the last reporting anybody has out of Kabul at the moment were these 3 very sketchy reports about huge explosions, missile attacks, both in and around the city and in the north of the city. Now, you're looking, this may be a little misleading to you at the moment. This is the distance from Islamabad to Kabul, but Islamabad is the capital of Pakistan, and we have no indication, no evidence whatsoever that the U.S. is going to be using Pakistan as a launch base at the moment. But here is Al Jazeera television, and now those white lights in the sky may well be tracer elements of anti-aircraft fire. This is quite an astonishing Middle East base based in the Persian Gulf very widely distributed news organization in which the Arab world particularly, but also Pakistan and Afghanistan, and to some extent Iran, are able to exchange views and hear the views of people all over the region. One of our specialists with us here today is Barney Rubin, author of several books on Afghanistan, the director of studies at the Center of International Cooperation. And Barney, what we're looking at means that the Arab world and Pakistan as well will be able to see precisely as much as we are.
Certainly, which at this point means not very little.
On the other hand, makes people in the region very aware that the United States has now begun a mission to Afghanistan.
Yes, that's correct. And they will be, of course, perceiving it in a variety of ways over the next few days and weeks. And I think one very important thing that will affect those perceptions will be what the other Afghan actors will do. If it seems to be just an attack by outsiders on Afghanistan, then they'll perceive it perhaps as an attack on the Muslim world. But if it's clear we're acting together with a large number of other Afghans who also want to get rid of the Taliban, it will have a very different political character.
Well, I know, Barry, that you've actually been talking to some of those other Afghan components or forces early today, and they've actually been urging the United States not to mount a military operation at this point and not to go it alone.
Their immediate concern was, on the one hand, that they weren't prepared politically. For surprisingly, what they're afraid of is not so much strong resistance by Taliban forces, because they believe that under this impact they are likely really to split and there will be massive defections. What they're concerned about is that they don't have a political alternative ready and in place, and furthermore that Pakistan is undertaking certain covert operations to undermine their attempts to put such a political alternative in place.
Thank you, Barney. While we're waiting for the President, I also want to bring in very briefly another ABC News consultant, former Army Special Operations Officer John Hillen, who, among other things, knows precisely what it is like to try to mount an airdrop at this time of the night in Afghanistan. How difficult, John?
It's very difficult, Peter. One of the things is, as General Hawley said, is the planes conducting the airdrop will need to fly at very high altitudes because of the air defense threats on the ground. And that's going to really negate the effectiveness of an airdrop. To have a really effective airdrop where you can deliver lots of humanitarian supplies to very precise places, planes basically need to go in low and slow, and that's dangerous work.
And while the United Nations, John, says again today that maybe 20-25% of the Afghan population is dependent on foreign aid, you're talking about dropping aid, if you're dropping it all over Afghanistan, in a huge place.
It's a very huge place. Much of the aid will end up in terrain that's very hard to get to. But we have a lot of experience in this. We did major drops in northern Iraq in 1991 after the Gulf War, and then also throughout the 90s in Bosnia and other parts of the Balkan Peninsula. But it's very difficult. It's somewhat ineffective, and only over time can you build up the sort of relief and humanitarian supplies that make a difference.
It's also potentially dangerous to people on the ground. John McCarthy was telling me this morning that the U.S. has actually tried to refine and make safer its airdrops, because in northern Iraq, when we were dropping food to the Kurds, many people got hit by these giant pallets that landed on them.
That's right. And the other thing is, I mean, by the very nature of wanting to put down a lot of humanitarian aid supplies and attract refugees who need them, you then also attract a population center that sometimes a terrorist or the Taliban, for instance, could be attracted to for different reasons. So there's a lot of permutations of a humanitarian airdrop. It's not just putting food right down to people who need it.
And of course, at night, you're simply doing it based on whatever coordinates you have, because you can't see anything.
That's very right. You know, the most effective way to deliver humanitarian aid is to fly the things in to a staging base that is set up where it can be immediately distributed, and that's much too dangerous and not in the cards right now. So I think this is just an initial step, and we're going to have to see how it goes. But it probably won't be too effective at first, but I think it'll give the United States a very good idea of how the Taliban is prepared to resist this and steps we can take to make it more effective.
Thank you, John. As we look at this picture live from Kabul in Afghanistan, it is not very live indeed, as you can see. And in fact, that same white light in the sky may well be a building, because we have no idea what the perspective is of the camera. We appear to have seen some tracers in the sky, part of an anti-aircraft component, but we cannot say for sure. It's about 10 o'clock at night in Kabul now, and we have you're hearing an extraordinary, I'm not sure if we have our Arabic interpreter with us today, but you're hearing very animated commentary on Al Jazeera, but we're not at this moment precisely what they are saying. Tony, Tony Cordesman again, our military analyst. We also do not know at the moment what this operation really is all about. But if, very big if here, if the U.S. is mounting a wider military attack against Taliban capabilities, what might they be doing?
Well, Peter, one of the things they're going to have to do is to knock out the air defense capabilities. That means getting rid of the major radars that still survive throughout Afghanistan. It means locating and destroying the heavy, high-altitude surface-to-air missiles. These are mobile. They're probably dispersed outside of Kabul over a good part of the country.
Tony, let me interrupt you. I apologize to the Pentagon and John McCarthy. John?
Peter, we are hearing that the airstrikes that are underway now are part of an orchestration that is going to last for several hours. The U.S. is pounding at the air defense capabilities of the Taliban initially. They are then going to bomb a broad set of targets over many hours, perhaps lasting until dawn or even more. It is also being characterized, this is not going to be a small plinking. This is going to be a major offensive strike to not only clear the way so that humanitarian aid can be brought in, but also to deliver the first blow after the attacks on the United States nearly a month ago.
I wondered, John, if we can divide that up, because you do not need a huge operation against Taliban defenses, which are fairly primitive at best, in order to drop humanitarian aid. So, as you said, this is now a major blow to clear the way for something in the days ahead.
Well, Peter, you need to do a couple of things. First of all, whenever you put an unarmed transport plane into hostile territory, you do need to take down anything that you believe is going to be a threat to an aircraft operating at relatively high altitude. They do have a certain number of jet fighters on the ground in Afghanistan. Those will be taken out. They do have radar systems. Those will be taken out. Whatever communications capabilities they have, any sort of central linking of communications, that undoubtedly will be taken out. And any of the air defense systems which they have gotten from Russia over the years, which it is far from clear that they even know how to use, those will be taken out preemptively.
Thanks, John.
But it's quite clear they also plan to strike a much broader set of targets that will be going after Osama bin Laden and the Taliban government, those things that hold both of those organizations together. That will be very difficult to hit these targets with effect, however.
Thanks very much, John McCarthy at the Pentagon. Tony Cordesman, we have about 30 or 40 seconds before President Bush comes to speak to the nation. But just give people at home a very clear idea how sophisticated or unsophisticated, usable or unusable, do we believe Taliban defenses of all dimensions are?
They are very unsophisticated. The problem is they're also very dispersed and hard to locate. So it takes a large-scale attack, even though this is an unsophisticated and poorly developed military.
Okay, thanks, Tony, very much, and everybody else. President Bush is now going to talk to the nation in about 30 seconds. He'll be talking to us from the treaty room on the second floor of the White House. And as ABC's John McCarthy, he is probably going to give us his impriway at the moment.
Good afternoon.
Here's the President.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime. We are joined in this operation by our staunch friend, Great Britain. Other close friends, including Canada, Australia, Germany, and France, have pledged forces as the operation unfolds. More than 40 countries in the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and across Asia have granted air transit or landing rights. Many more have shared intelligence. We are supported by the collective will of the world. More than 2 weeks ago, I gave Taliban leaders a series of clear and specific demands. Close terrorist training camps, hand over leaders of the al-Qaeda network, and return all foreign nationals, including American citizens, unjustly detained in your country. None of these demands were met. And now, the Taliban will pay a price. By destroying camps and disrupting communications, we will make it more difficult for the terror network to train new recruits and coordinate their evil plans. Initially, the terrorists may burrow deeper into caves and other entrenched hiding places. Our military action is also designed to clear the way for sustained, comprehensive, and relentless operations to drive them out and bring them to justice. At the same time, the oppressed people of Afghanistan will know the generosity of America and our allies. As we strike military targets, we will also drop food, medicine, and supplies to the starving and suffering men and women and children of Afghanistan. The United States of America is a friend to the Afghan people, and we are the friends of almost 1 billion worldwide who practice the Islamic faith. The United States of America is an enemy of those who aid terrorists and of the barbaric criminals who profane a great religion by committing murder in its name. This military action is a part of our campaign against terrorism, another front in a war that has already been joined through diplomacy, intelligence, the freezing of financial assets, and the arrests of known terrorists by law enforcement agents in 38 countries. Given the nature and reach of our enemies, we will win this conflict by the patient accumulation of successes, by meeting a series of challenges with determination and will and purpose. Today we focus on Afghanistan, but the battle is broader. Every nation has a choice to make. In this conflict, there is no neutral ground. If any government sponsors the outlaws and killers of innocents, they have become outlaws and murderers themselves, and they will take that lonely path at their own peril. I'm speaking to you today from the treaty room of the White House, a place where American presidents have worked for peace. We're a peaceful nation. Yet as we have learned so suddenly and so tragically, there can be no peace in a world of sudden terror. In the face of today's new threat, the only way to pursue peace is to pursue those who threaten it. We did not ask for this mission, but we will fulfill it. The name of today's military operation is Enduring Freedom. We defend not only our precious freedoms, but also the freedom of people everywhere to live and raise their children free from fear. I know many Americans feel fear today, and our government is taking strong precautions. All law enforcement and intelligence agencies are working aggressively around America, around the world, and around the clock. At my request, many governors have activated the National Guard to strengthen airport security. We have called up reserves to reinforce our military capability and strengthen the protection of our homeland. In the months ahead, our patience will be one of our strengths. Patience with the long waits that will result from tighter security. Patience in understanding that it will take time to achieve our goals. Patience in all the sacrifices that may come. Today, those sacrifices are being made by members of our armed forces who now defend us so far from home, and by their proud and worried families. A commander-in-chief sends America's sons and daughters into a battle in a foreign land only after the greatest care and a lot of prayer. We ask a lot of those who wear our uniform. We ask them to leave their loved ones, to travel great distances, to risk injury, even to be prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice of their lives. They are dedicated. They are honorable. They represent the best of our country, and we are grateful. To all the men and women in our military, every sailor, every soldier, every airman, every Coast Guardsman, every Marine, I say this: your mission is defined, your objectives are clear, your goal is just. You have my full confidence, and you will have every tool you need to carry out your duty. I recently received a touching letter that says a lot about the state of America in these difficult times. A letter from a 4th grade girl with a father in the military. As much as I don't want my dad to fight, she wrote, I'm willing to give him to you. This is a precious gift, the greatest she could give. This young girl knows what America is all about. Since September 11, an entire generation of young Americans has gained new understanding of the value of freedom and its cost in duty and in sacrifice. The battle is now joined on many fronts. We will not waver. We will not tire. We will not falter. And we will not fail. Peace and freedom will prevail. Thank you. May God continue to bless America.
President Bush talking to us from the treaty room in the White House. It's a little after 1 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern time. It's 8.5 hours later in Afghanistan, in Kabul at least. It is the middle of the night. And so it has begun. The battle, as the president put it, has now been joined. Taliban did not meet the demands. A couple of new pieces of information from the president himself. Let me go first back to the Pentagon and John McWethy, that there are British forces, or at least aircraft, John, perhaps in the mission tonight.
A very broad set of forces on the mission tonight, Peter. We have gotten some indications that the food drops are going to be a little later in this sequence. They want to soften up whatever air defenses there are and to make sure that there is general chaos on the ground when unmanned transport planes try to come over Afghani airspace. Not only is the president confirming the breadth of this kind of attack, there are some things that he did not mention, which we believe will also be targets. One of the important sources of revenue for the Taliban has been heroin. The United States believes that they know where some of those storage areas are. Those will be among the target sets to reduce their ability to generate income to support themselves.
Okay, and just a couple of other things, John. Thanks very much. According to Reuters is still managing to file from Kabul itself. Reuters now says that the Kandahar Airport Command base is said to be destroyed. And Reuters also says that there have been an attack near the Defense Ministry in Kabul, according to eyewitnesses on the ground. But it is as sparse as that from Kabul itself, and as you saw earlier from the Middle Eastern Television Network, there's not much evidence in the sky, at least from their perspective. And all we know is that they are allegedly in Kabul. Let me come back to Tony Cordersman. Tony Cordersman, the president said here, which we hadn't talked about this morning up until this point, was that the attacks or the targets would also include some of the camps of Osama bin Laden. We know where some of them were some time ago. Do we know where they are today?
We don't in the media, Peter. These are old maps, but understand we've had 2 weeks for satellite coverage, to pick up things with SIGINT, to use unmanned aerial vehicles, and to put a mosaic together that gives us the ability to know if he's moved out of these camps and to know where his forces are throughout Afghanistan. And we have vastly superior precision-guided systems and avionics on our aircraft that can operate at night, munitions which can strike regardless of the weather without using lasers. So when we talk about U.S. air capabilities, they're far advanced beyond the Gulf War, and we may have a map of Taliban capabilities which is extraordinarily sophisticated in its targeting capability.
I want to bring in John Hillen, former Army Special Operations Officer. John, we're always reluctant to speculate at a moment like this. However, it has been widely surmised in the last couple of weeks that there were U.S. forces and perhaps British and even Russian forces somewhere inside Afghanistan. Given your own experience, would they be playing a role this evening?
I think they would be, Peter. I mean, there's 3 operations the Pentagon has talked about here. There's the humanitarian relief operations, there's the bombing, and then there's special operations, which I imagine are ongoing, not only to collect information, but to possibly use it for targeting. All 3 of those operations have one thing in common. They all will have much of their resources delivered by air, whether it's people or supplies. And so tonight's operation, which seems to be centered on the suppression of the Taliban's air defense network, will be critical to the success of any of those 3 types of operations.
Let me bring back in Barney Rubin, who, at least in this company, knows Afghanistan itself better than anybody else, at least in our company today. And Barney, when John McWethy uses the phrase causing chaos in Afghanistan, the Pentagon uses a phrase such as a continuous operation for the next several hours. Try to look at it, if you would, from the perspective of the ground.
Well, first of all, the Taliban have 2 centers, or capitals, rather than one. Kabul, where the government is, and Kandahar, where their leader actually is. In addition to which, they are also operating on a front in the far north near Mazar-e-Sharif, which one of your correspondents earlier said was where the Northern Alliance is concentrating its forces. Those are heavily strung out. They need radio communications in order to coordinate them, and they also need an air link in order to move supplies back and forth. So attacks on airports and possibly on their communications would disrupt their ability to coordinate all of those things.
Now, just to give people, again, Barney, some kind of perspectives, the Soviets tried for 10 years to subdue Afghanistan with air power and with ground power. They weren't successful in the final analysis. I guess I'm trying to get some perspective of how big a U.S. military operation this would have to be to make a real impact on the ground from a ground level perspective.
Well, I think that this operation is actually totally different in its goals from the Soviet operation. The Soviet operation was, as you said, trying to subdue Afghanistan and impose a very unpopular and illegitimate regime. I think what you have now in Afghanistan is a very unpopular and illegitimate regime, and we've been getting lots and lots of messages from within the Taliban for the past couple of weeks, and I've heard this from both the Northern Alliance and from southern Afghanistan, Kandahar, the base of the Taliban, that there are many, many people who are prepared to defect once they see that the United States is taking action. So I think you're not only going to see the degrading of the Taliban's technical capabilities, but frankly, they're going to lose a lot of support, and people they thought were on their side are going to turn against them.
Now, we heard two reports from Kabul itself, one that hit near the Defense Ministry and one the Kandahar airport. Can you put those in geographical perspective for us?
Well, the Defense Ministry is actually in the center of town. I would be very worried about civilian casualties if they are trying to hit it, though it's not in a residential district. The airport is somewhat outside of the city to the east in a fairly isolated area. It has both a civilian and a military part, but it's a rather small and elementary sort of airport.
Thanks, Barney. Back to Tony Cordersman. Tony, maybe I'm overusing McWethy's phrase here, trying to cause chaos, but part of the goal here surely is to peel people away from the Taliban and leave the leadership, at least, of the Taliban pretty isolated, right?
Absolutely, Peter, and they are very vulnerable because they rely on about 250 armored vehicles, 100 tanks, less than 40 aircraft, a handful of helicopters for their strength. Their basic weapon is the truck, and if they can't move and they can't supply, they can't fight.
So one of the targets tonight may well be roads such as they are, bridges such as they are, pathways in some cases in the mountainous parts of the country such as they are.
That's possible, Peter, but I think that what we'll really see is the fixed depots, the facilities they need, the communication centers
That's Kandahar
are going
down
to be
there.
hit and hit hard.
That's up near Jalalabad.
There are about 30 elements of the Taliban regular forces. A lot of them, as just pointed out, are dissidents. If we hit at the core units that are dispersed throughout the country that are loyal to the Taliban, take out their limited military assets, that's chaos because no one has to be loyal to the government and it can't deal with its own dissidents.
All right, let me just move slightly off the immediate subject of this attack for the moment and go to the White House first to hear ABC's Terry Moran. Terry, what was the day like at the White House which led up to this? There were a lot of meetings this morning, I know.
Peter, the president was out at Camp David for a very abbreviated weekend. He left there well ahead of schedule. He was in Emmitsburg, Maryland earlier for an annual ceremony at the National Fallen Firefighters Memorial, which takes on added importance and poignancy this year, given the number of firefighters who lost their lives in New York and Washington. And then he was back here. He went right to the Oval Office. We're told he was meeting with staff members of the National Security Council. He also, we're told, took a walk out into the South Lawn with his dogs and knocked in a few putts on the putting green, which is very typical of the way he makes decisions. And in those brief remarks, he really did state very comprehensively the policy. On my orders, he began, and he made clear that those orders began with the attack not just against al-Qaeda, but against the Taliban. And so he is making clear that one of the objectives is to remove that regime from power. And then he went on to address the Afghani people, saying that they are oppressed and they will know our generosity. A lot of different constituencies, once again trying to make clear that this is not a war against Islam, but, and this struck me as very significant, saying that this operation is the beginning of this longer campaign against terrorism that he has announced, putting other nations on notice. That has been a very controversial aspect of this campaign. The first goal is clear, but what about the secondary and tertiary goals? And finally, try to reassure the American people in what is going to be a time of fear.
Calling this mission Enduring Freedom and saying the goal is just. Were there other atmospherics around the White House today? Who's there? Secretary of Defense been there? The Vice President been there?
Well, we haven't seen either, although the Vice President, although he's been behind the scenes, has been very active. We've seen him a couple of times behind the scenes. He is obviously President Bush's right-hand man in all of these things. And the President is made his decision and seems to be moving forward with it. One person who's known him a long time said to me recently, the thing to remember about George W. Bush is he's an oil man. He brings his checkbook to the table. By that, he meant that in the oil business, when you take a gamble on a well, you don't look back. You just write the check and have no regrets about the decision. And that is the kind of decision maker that so far George W. Bush has proven to be.
Thanks, Terry, very much. I want to check in a moment with Dan Harris, our correspondent who's in Pakistan, because the first reaction clearly to this will come from Pakistan right next door, see what the Northern Alliance is saying. But we're joined at the moment by ABC's Pierre Thomas, who covers the Justice Department and the FBI for us in Washington. He's in the Bureau today. Pierre, when I was coming into the office this morning, I heard local radio reports that parts of this city were going to be closed down or tightened down or locked down as soon as this operation began. Is the Justice Department doing anything unusual this morning?
Yes, Peter, the FBI director and all of his leadership met this morning. They obviously had been informed that attacks were imminent. And what you see the FBI beginning to do is to play defense. There's real concern, although they have no specific threats in the United States right now, there's concern that there could be sleeper cells, people who are dormant, but people who are poised to act against the United States. So the FBI over the past few weeks has been hardening facilities at water treatment plants, at dams, nuclear power plants. So the FBI has been preparing for this military action.
Thanks very much, Pierre Thomas in Washington. Now to Pakistan, to the Pakistani capital, Islamabad, and ABC's Dan Harris. Dan, first of all, in Pakistan, other than you, do people know this has begun?
My sense is that the government here was not aware of the timing of this. In fact, we spoke to the foreign ministry. They said that they had no idea about the timing of the attacks, and in fact found out they had begun through a phone call from ABC News. So if the government doesn't know, it's unclear whether the people here know. There is a Pakistani TV station that broadcasts throughout the nation. One would imagine that they are broadcasting similar images to what we've been broadcasting. The reaction here from Islamic fundamentalists will be key. The worry, as you well know, Peter, throughout has been what the Islamic fundamentalists will do. Will they be angry? There have been protests, but as you know, those protests have been small and controlled under Pakistani standards. The sense is that the military government here has its radical Islamic right flank under a reasonable amount of control, but that concern has been there all along that there would be some sort of popular uprising due to the support that the Pakistani government has given to the West in this war on terrorism.
Thanks very much, Dan Harris in Islamabad. Indeed, a very unpredictable country. Reading the Pakistani English language newspapers this morning, and there was no sense in the papers that anything like this was particularly imminent. But I noticed that President Musharraf, as you know, came to office as the result of a coup. He's a military officer, had this morning had his job as Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces extended. It didn't seem to be an enormous surprise to anybody. Now, that's a picture of some days ago of General Musharraf. Back to northern Afghanistan, to the Northern Alliance and David Wright. David, not many spokesmen for the Northern Alliance, but certainly Dr. Abdullah, has he had something to say about this yet?
Well, he had something to say earlier today, a suggestion at least that this attack would be imminent. He has cried wolf a number of times, though, but when asked earlier today whether it was going to happen soon, he said not just soon, very soon. What time? He asked, what time is it now? One of our producers here, Gretchen Peters, has been working the satellite phone in the past half an hour, talking with various Northern Alliance commanders on the front line. And most recently, she talked with Uzbek General Rashid Dostum, who is a warlord who's gone back a great many years here in Afghanistan. And he clarified, at least to her, some of the targets beyond the two that have already been mentioned. He said that there was the Kabul airport, the Kandahar airport, also Herat airport, and Mazar-e Sharif airport. It gives you a sense of at least some of the targets that may be in play here as the U.S. begins what seems to be a broader attack.
Thanks, David. David Wright in northern Afghanistan with, as he puts it, the United Front, which we tend to call the Northern Alliance. Not, by the way, the most popular group in the country, as we've heard from any number of our Afghan specialists in the last couple of days and weeks. And you at home must now be very aware of. Afghanistan has been riven by rivalry. And in some respects, the Taliban itself came to power in part because there was so much rivalry, and it was at least seen as a force which would bring order to Pakistan. Certainly not this evening. A couple of other overseas notes as we look at this picture from Kabul, which doesn't, as I said, tell us very much. The German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder has said he backs the U.S. strikes against the terrorist targets in Afghanistan. Prime Minister Blair's office in London confirms that British forces are involved in the military strikes, but on Afghanistan. And I'm told, Tony Cordesman, our military analyst, that it's a British submarine participating at the moment, not aircraft. And the only thing I can think, do the British submarines have sea-launched cruise missiles on them?
They do indeed, Peter. That was one of the lessons of British power projection, and they actually increased the number of cruise missiles they were buying for these submarines about a year ago.
Okay, Tony, thanks very much. Back to the Pentagon, John McWethy.
Peter, for the first time in combat, a British submarine has fired a Tomahawk cruise missile. That was part of the first wave of the attack earlier today. So the British have joined the U.S. in this attack, as the president said, but interestingly, from one of their submarines. There were also Tomahawk cruise missiles fired from a series of American surface ships as they went after this first wave of targets. We are still waiting for details about any of the manned bomber force, which we believe will be part of follow-on attacks.
Jack, again, trying to get a geographical perspective on this. If the U.S. and Britain were launching sea-launched cruise missiles, where would those ships be located? In the array, how far away could they be successfully positioned?
They can be a long way. They could actually fire from the Persian Gulf, and that, of course, would mean that they were overflying Iranian territory.
That's right.
More probably, Peter, they are firing from the Arabian Sea over Pakistani territory. The Pakistanis have given the U.S. permission to overfly their airspace on these kind of combat missions.
Okay, now, Jack, just while we still have the map there, do we have any indication as to whether or not these transport planes came in through the north, through Turkey, and then down across Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan into Afghanistan? Or does this appear at the moment to be a southern-based military operation?
Peter, I would be hesitant to say that the cargo aircraft have begun their part of this mission yet. It seems pretty clear to me from people that we're talking to at the Pentagon that they wanted to suppress all capabilities of Afghani air defense before they brought those unarmed transport planes into the area. My clear sense is that they would come in from the north and approach the areas that the U.S. believes will be most in need of that kind of assistance from the north.
Go talk to your source. I'm going to go back to Tony Cordesman again, because, Tony, I think it would be helpful to remind folks the efficiency, the effectiveness, and the reasons for a cruise missile rather than a manned aircraft. Now, the obvious one is that you don't put a pilot in danger. But how efficient are they? Are they particularly good for one mission or another?
Peter, they're much more sophisticated systems than they were during the Gulf War, when only about half hit near the target. They now have satellite guidance, so we would estimate perhaps 70 to 80% could hit with precision. They have enough of a warhead to hit most buildings. They also have cluster munitions, which they can use to attack dispersed targets. One advantage of them is they are so precise, they're not dependent on weather, they don't care what altitude it is, and they don't have to maneuver. So that gives them the ability to strike, and also it gives us the ability to reduce collateral damage.
Well, That sounds a little bit to me, Tony, like the kind of thing we said at the Gulf War when we started to talk about precision and efficiency, and in fact the truth is we don't know. Coming in, does it make any difference that they come in from the south and they don't have to deal with quite the mountainous terrain as they might in the north? Does it make any difference to a cruise missile at all?
It really won't, because they have to fly close to the ground in any case. There's a lot of maneuver almost regardless. It does reduce the need perhaps to draw down on the fuel. But Peter, a point. When I say 70%, that means 30% goes somewhere else. And precision is always a very relative word.
Okay, precisely. Thank you very much, Tony. I want to bring Barney Rubin back in one again, and also ABC's Judith Kipper. I, again, don't want to get ahead of developments here, but Barney, let me ask you, and then Judith Kipper. If the United States is seen tonight as well, if there is what the military calls collateral damage, if civilians are killed in this attack tonight, what are the consequences of that, do you think, both in Afghanistan and in the surrounding countries?
I think that if those images of civilians that are killed are shown, particularly in Pakistan and also in the rest of the world, those will start to mobilize people against the United States. I would say initially I would expect that reaction in Pakistan, though the government there has taken some measures to put that under control. And of course it will also look visually as like a contradiction to what the president said, which is that we are not attacking the Afghan people, even if we did it unintentionally.
The president has said every single time he has spoken, this is not attack against Islam. In fact, he said these terrorists defame a great nation today of Islam. Is that a message, as far as you can tell, is getting through?
I think people hear him saying that around the world. In the Islamic world, there is such a high degree of distrust of the United States that so far many people are skeptical of that. They overreacted, in my view, to his off-the-cuff use of the word crusade.
Right.
But most important, what they want to hear from the United States is not that we respect Islam as a religion, but that we are willing to take seriously the political concerns that people in the Islamic world have about a number of our policies. He's made some gestures on that score, which I think will, in the long run, be more important.
Let's invite now another of our analysts in ABC's Judith Kipper. Judith, General Musharraf, he's been much more pro the United States in the last week or so. Maybe pro is a bit too strong, than people had imagined he was going to be. Does that speak to his confidence in keeping Pakistan together now that this has happened?
I think President Musharraf didn't have any choice. It was very clear that as a military leader, when the United States came to him, that he really had to do what was necessary to do, or his government would never have survived. I think Pakistan may be problematic. There are obviously a lot of madrasas and radicals and Osama bin Laden supporters and possibly Arab fighters from Afghanistan that have slipped out in 1998 and even now who may be residing in Pakistan. So Pakistan is definitely a place to watch in terms of stability as this military action continues.
Okay, thanks very much, Judith Kipper. Madrasas, to which Judith refers, are the Muslim schools in Pakistan, many of them set up with U.S. aid money under the former president, President Zia, and it is from some of them, they're not all by any means hotbeds of extremism, but there are some of them from which bin Laden and the more conservative elements in Islam, sometimes even the more extremist elements, have been able to recruit young boys for the cause. John Miller is with us, who has been a tremendous support to us since this began on September the 11th. I mentioned that I'd heard on the radio this morning about the fact that New York City and other places were going to be, quote, locked down as a result of this, in large measure because people throughout the country are still fairly nervous.
Well, there are newspaper reports to that effect, and I've spoken to some of the top command of the city's law enforcement and emergency response people today. What they say is that we are, these are the terms that they use, we are on a heightened condition omega. They have this broken down to a series of response levels. Alpha, condition alpha is when everything's normal. Beta is when they're on a heightened alert because they have some intelligence that something's going on anywhere in the world that could affect us. Gamma is when they have specific, credible intelligence. And of course, omega is when they have an actual incident. So the NYPD, the emergency response system here, has been on what they call condition omega since the incident.
You mean
now,
since the 11th?
Since the 11th.
Right, yeah.
Now I'm told that they are on what they are characterizing as omega plus.
Yeah.
It's the heightened alert, it's the overtime packages, the emergency response systems with the actual emergency service units on patrol and in fixed locations, more bomb squad people in place. And that is something they've put together in the last couple of days. New York City, I am told by these officials, has never been on this.
Omega Plus.
It hasn't even existed. I mean, Omega was the top they had, and they've added to that. The question of lockdown. There are streets and buildings, particularly the federal courthouses where the FBI is working, those places that will be locked down. But as far as a lockdown of the city, meaning shutting bridges and tunnels to traffic, keeping anything from coming in or out, I am told that's not going to happen. That's not in the plan unless there's a specific reason to make that happen.
And do you get any sense that it is similar in other parts of the country at the moment?
Well, I've spoken to police chiefs in Baltimore, in Philadelphia, up in smaller cities in Maine, and they have all come up with their own versions of these plans. Another thing that's going on in New York since the incident is really the concern about chemical and biological terrorism. What they've done here is they've increased surveillance at hospitals, and surveillance is used in a different term here. These are medical experts who are in place in major city hospitals looking for that disease. They can't identify anything odd. That they have people from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, from their epidemiology investigative services here, response teams, to move quickly to a hospital if one of those surveillances turns up something they can't explain, to get to the bottom of it right away, because with a chemical attack it'll become apparent immediately. But with a biological attack, that's the kind of thing where you really have to watch what people are coming into emergency rooms with that may mask as flu or meningitis or something else. Now, of course, they haven't had any of that.
No.
But this is all not here. Yeah. This is all part of the package that they've put together, which is quite incredible.
Okay, John, thanks very much. We'll let you go on reporting. I'm going to go back to Uzbekistan now and put the map up again, because one of the hardest things, I think we all agree, for all of us in one respect or another, is to fully understand the geography of the region. I'd actually like the wider map if I could. Well, I'll settle for air bases for a moment because I want to talk to ABC's Bill Redeker, who is in Uzbekistan tonight. Bill, in the last day or so, about 1,000 members of the 10th Mountain Division from Fort Drum in New York have been arriving in Uzbekistan. Do we have the slightest idea of where they are and what their intentions are?
Our best guess, Peter, is that they're in an area directly behind me. Perhaps you can see that glow of light on the horizon. And since we talked to you last, we've noticed a number of things happening here. One, we saw some what we believe to be military aircraft flying low across the horizon, and we also think we noticed some helicopter activity. It's our impression, that said, that the C-17 transports that are here are primarily here to support the humanitarian mission more than a military mission, as Jack McQuethy had been talking to you about earlier.
The president of Uzbekistan told John McQuethy the other day that Uzbekistan could only be used for search and rescue, but I gather he's got a pretty loose interpretation of search and rescue.
The way we hear it is search and rescue. Search is underlined. One other thing to add to all of that, Peter, and that is we spent some time today talking to people here. It's really quite phenomenal when you think about this as a staging area from 1979 to 1989, when the U.S. was supporting the Mujahideen, fighting the Russians who were coming from this direction. Now, of course, we're here taking on them across the border. But there's broad support among the people here for what the U.S. is doing. One woman told us, well, the Russians, our soldiers were not as strong as the U.S., so we think the U.S. has a good chance at trying to end this global terrorism. So there's that kind of support here.
As in your travel, by the way, there's a slight delay in the passage of the sound from here to Uzbekistan and back. In your travels through the region to get where you are, did you find any particularly overt anti-Americanism at all?
Not here, and there's a couple of reasons for that. There's a bit of a border insurgency problem in this country, as there is throughout the stands, if you will, that border of Afghanistan. So there's quite a bit of support for what the U.S. and its allies are up to. But I didn't, to be honest with you, notice any of that, although I know there is some sectors of this country that are somewhat unstable.
Many thanks, Bill Redeker, who's in Karshi in Uzbekistan tonight. You probably know, because it's been all over the news for the last few days, that there's a tremendous movement of refugees in Afghanistan. Clearly, a lot of people believed this attack was coming, fled their homes, begun to try to make their ways to the border, Iran in the west, Pakistan in the south, up towards the other stands. By the way, stands means land, which is why you hear Pakistan, Uzbekistan, to the north, and they've been trying desperately to get food aid into them as well. But one of the places where this attack will undoubtedly cause greater pressure, at least in the short run, is on the Pakistan border near Quetta. And ABC's Bob Woodruff is in Quetta tonight. Bob, it's late in the evening there. Any reaction to this? Any knowledge of this at all?
Well, Peter, first of all, let me just tell you that we have been searching the skies here and we have not seen anything fly overhead as of yet. But we just heard through one of our Afghan translators here who spoke to a friend of his on the border of Afghanistan, and which is about 2 hours from the Kandahar airport. He said that earlier tonight he had heard some aircraft of some kind flying overhead about an hour ago that could have been planes or cruise missiles. And then he saw about 30 different flashes near where the Kandahar airport would be. This is coming from an eyewitness on the border of Afghanistan in the crossing point of Chaman. That is all we know so far, but he did say also one interesting thing which may indicate that the Pakistanis did know this was coming and were taking action. He said at about 6 or 7 o'clock tonight, that's about 9 or 10 in the morning your time, that the border from Pakistan into Afghanistan that goes in towards Kandahar was closed by the Pakistani government. This is according to someone who's up on the Chaman border crossing about 2 hours from the Kandahar airport.
And Kandahar is more towards the southern part of Afghanistan, but hasn't that border been closed for the last several days so that refugees don't get into Pakistan anyway?
Well, it's been closed to all refugees, definitely, so they don't go in and out, but it has been open to commercial traffic, and apparently even all that was closed off just a few hours ago.
Okay, now Bob, you've been there in Pakistan for, I guess, almost since September the 11th. What's your appreciation at the moment of whether or not Pakistan will support this, and I know the government does and President Musharraf does, without adding to instability?
Well, one of the things that they've told us from the very beginning is what they don't want to see is any civilian casualties. They've drawn the line at using Pakistani troops to go into Afghanistan, but as you know, they're supporting the U.S. efforts in terms of logistics and flyover rights and intelligence sharing. But if we do see a substantial number of civilian casualties, Peter, the fundamentalist parties here have said that they will take to the streets. Of course, the Taliban has announced that they will declare a jihad against the West. And what will be very interesting is to see what the anti-Taliban parties inside Pakistan do, because they have told us also from the very beginning that they do not want to see an American strike. They want the Afghans to do this themselves. They want to go in and hold what's called a Loya Jirga, which is a traditional Afghan Grand Council meeting, to get their political house in order before there's any kind of military action taken against the Taliban. So it'll be interesting to see what their reaction is tonight. I think it'll be fairly predictable that the fundamentalists will go out in the streets.
Thanks very much, Bob Woodruff. The Associated Press, by the way, reports from Karachi, farther to the south of Bob, down near the on the Pakistani coast, that the Taliban diplomat there, Taliban pretty deeply involved in Pakistan and vice versa in many ways, says we are ready for jihad. And as you probably know, having listened and watched this for the last several weeks, there are a variety of different interpretations of jihad or holy war and what it actually means, but that's at least the first comment we've had from anybody even remotely connected to the Taliban tonight. And as John McWethy told us at the Pentagon from the very outset, this is a long and concentrated bombing campaign which is expected to last for several hours. The president saying that it was directed not just against the Taliban, but at the various camps and locations, as best anyone knows them, of Al-Qaeda, the bin Laden organization itself. So, as I said, it's about it's about 11 o'clock, quarter to 11, maybe 11 o'clock at night in Afghanistan now, and the country, based on what we've been told here, is under very, very heavy attack. We're joined by General Richard Hawley, another ABC News consultant who we're glad to have on these occasions, the former commander of Air Combat Command in the United States.
We're on.
Beg your pardon, sir? Oh, we're on. Yes, indeed you are, sir. Can you, again, just using your imagination and your knowledge, and try to give us a picture of what's happening at the moment?
Well, I think what we're seeing is the early stages of a campaign to essentially disarm the Taliban regime and destroy as much of the infrastructure of the al-Qaeda organization as we can in order to allow the further prosecution of two campaigns. One will be the humanitarian airdrops that the president mentioned, and the other will be to get some people on the ground, get an eyeball on the target so we can begin to pin down the location and eventually take out the underpinnings of the al-Qaeda organization, whether from the bottom to the top or from the top to the bottom, starting with Osama bin Laden.
Well, what is your definition of infrastructure and al-Qaeda?
Well, the most prominent infrastructure that they've got, and I think the president mentioned it, was the training camps. They also have some other infrastructure, which I'm sure we have spent the last 2 weeks trying to identify. As I think Tony mentioned earlier, the extensive overhead surveillance, as well as whatever capabilities we have been able to put on the ground or glean from our allies in the area will be very important.
General Hawley, based on the fact that everybody seems to think that Osama bin Laden is an extremely intelligent man with a very efficient and intelligent organization for the most part, do you believe any bin Laden operative in his right mind is in one of those camps tonight?
I would not expect anybody to be in those camps. I think this is purely a case where we're going to take out the infrastructure in order to prevent their future use. And then if they try to set up some other place where they can conduct the kind of training that turns these terrorists loose on the world, they'll be destroyed just as quickly as they're attempted to be put together. So this is a long-term campaign. It's going to take a while, and we're going to have to make sure that we keep an eye on them and continue to prosecute these attacks for as long as the threat remains in place.
General Hawley, thanks very much. We'll come back to you to Islamabad and ABC's Stan Harris. Stan?
Peter, we're getting reaction now from the Taliban ambassador to Pakistan, a man by the name of Abdul Zaif. He is calling the U.S. campaign a terrorist attack. I'm going to quote him now. He says, "We, the Taliban, tried to solve the problems, but the Americans adopted the path of arrogance, killing innocent Afghanis. The Americans," he says, "will be held responsible." As you might imagine, the Bush administration would take issue with the characterization that the Taliban tried to solve the problems. Just a few hours before the campaign began, the Taliban's ambassador did offer, again, he repeated the Taliban's offer to go after bin Laden, detain him, and put him on trial if the United States made a formal request and provided evidence. The White House rejected that offer, once again saying it was insufficient. Peter?
Okay, thanks, Dan. I want to ask again Barney Rubin, our Afghan specialist here. Barney, one of the families that's going to be deeply concerned tonight, and there'll be many, of course, will be the family of the young Christian missionary to Afghanistan who's been held for some time for proselytizing in the country and was about to go on trial. The Taliban said they would release her. Is it in the Taliban's nature to protect this young woman?
I think the Taliban statement was that they would release her and the other 7 who are being held if the United States called off its threat of attack. I would think now that the Taliban are probably in a state of great disorganization and that those prisoners are in great danger, whether from someone giving an order to kill them or simply from some kind of random violence that might take place.
Okay, thanks, Barney, very much. Al Jazeera television, which you've been watching over the last little while, that hasn't showed us a great deal this evening, does now report that the Taliban headquarters in Kandahar, which is farther to the south in Afghanistan, has actually been destroyed. And they also say on Al Jazeera that President Musharraf of Pakistan was indeed aware of the timing of the attack. We were not certain about that a little earlier in the evening. Yes, indeed. This is our opposite number in Al Jazeera television tonight, and somewhere in this system here we have an Arabic interpreter, and when we get that organized, let's listen.
We can confirm that some areas have been bombed and they were selected, such as the airport, as well as some anti-aircraft positions. Some of the missiles have hit some of the positions. As well, I can report that some parts of the town have regained the electricity. About 1/3 of the town have regained its electricity. The western part of the town is dark. However, the northern part have some light. Some parts of it is still dark. I can say now about a half of the town regained the electricity. We lost electricity in Kabul once the bombing started. How can you explain that? Why did the electricity stop? Well, I have only one explanation. I believe that the electricity was lost because of the bombing. However, they were able to restore it. Some of the bombing. Now we can see you on our screen. On the other half of the screen, we can notice the sky of Kabul. Please continue.
نعم أعود فأقول أن ما ذكره مساعد وزير الدفاع الأمريكي أو مسؤول العسكري الأمريكي.
What has mentioned by the American military sources, I believe, is true. The targeted areas were basically selected, and I believe that the other targets will be bombed later. However, we feel that since the electricity is back, we notice some cars running in the city. Also, we believe that some of the Taliban members are trying to re-establish communication. However, there are plenty of restrictions of movement for security reasons. Any car has to have several permissions as well as secret passwords. Might be shot. Drivers might be shot. So only traffic, military traffic, is permitted in the town. I also can confirm that the military command center has been hit. The Taliban had described the attack to be a terrorist attack on Kabul. We heard that Kuwait in Pakistan is a ghost town. Can we say the same about Kabul? Well, I believe that lights in the town remind me of the same situation like last night. I believe that movement is almost completely stopped, with the exception of the military movement for the Taliban. We know that the Pakistanis have ordered people who live in Kuwait to stay home, and I think this was done because some of the American forces might be on their way to the Kuwait airport, which is about 50 kilometers from the border of Afghanistan. Also, we believe it's much closer to Kandahar, and this will make the job easy.
It's quite fascinating when you think about it. Here we are listening to live broadcasting from Kabul via an Arabic reporter through an Arabic television company based in the Persian Gulf in Qatar, which has been a real window on the world for people all over the region. It's where they have some of their most intense debates about this whole issue. And now we are able to plug into Kabul and listening to him as you have been. He was asked there a short while ago to compare what was going on in Kabul to Quetta, which is in Pakistan. And the people in Pakistan had been asked to stay home, and so it was totally quiet. And the reporter, at least in Kabul, was saying it's fairly quiet as well. This is the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair.
As you will know from the announcement by President Bush, military action against targets inside Afghanistan has begun. I can confirm that UK forces are engaged in this action. I want to pay tribute, if I might, right at the outset, to Britain's armed forces. There is no greater strength for a British Prime Minister and the British nation at a time like this than to know that the forces we are calling upon are amongst the very best in the world. They and their families are, of course, carrying an immense burden at this moment and will be feeling deep anxiety, as will the British people. But we can take pride in their courage, their sense of duty, and the esteem with which they're held throughout the world. No country lightly commits forces to military action and the inevitable risks involved. But we made it clear, following the attacks upon the United States on September the 11th, that we would take part in action once it was clear who was responsible. There is no doubt in my mind, nor in the mind of anyone who has been through all the available evidence, including intelligence material, that these attacks were carried out by the Al-Qaeda network masterminded by Osama bin Laden. Equally, it is clear that his network is harbored and supported by the Taliban regime inside Afghanistan. It is now almost a month since the atrocity occurred. It is more than 2 weeks since an ultimatum was delivered to the Taliban to yield up the terrorists or face the consequences. It is clear beyond doubt that they will not do this. They were given the choice of siding with justice or siding with terror, and they chose to side with terror. There are three parts, all equally important to the operation in which we're engaged: military, diplomatic, and humanitarian. The military action we are taking will be targeted against places we know to be involved in the Al-Qaeda network of terror or against the military apparatus of the Taliban. This military plan has been put together mindful of our determination to do all we humanly can to avoid civilian casualties. I cannot disclose, obviously, how long this action will last, but we will act with reason and resolve. We have set the objectives to eradicate Osama bin Laden's network of terror and to take action against the Taliban regime that is sponsoring him. As to the precise British involvement, I can confirm that last Wednesday, the United States government made a specific request that a number of UK military assets be used in the operation which has now begun, and I gave authority for these assets to be deployed. They include the base at Diego Garcia, reconnaissance and other aircraft, and missile-firing submarines. The missile-firing submarines are in use tonight. The air assets will be available for use in the coming days. The United States are obviously providing the bulk of the force required and leading this operation. But this is an international effort. As well as the UK, France, Germany, Australia, and Canada have also committed themselves to take part in it. On the diplomatic and political front, in the time I've been Prime Minister, I cannot recall a situation that has commanded so quickly such a powerful coalition of support, and not just from those countries directly involved in military action, but from many others in all parts of the world. That coalition has, I believe, strengthened, not weakened, in the 26 days since the atrocity occurred. And this is in no small measure due to the statesmanship of President Bush, to whom I pay tribute tonight. The world understands that whilst, of course, there are dangers in acting, the dangers of inaction are far, far greater. The threat